And you've interviewed Cuban before, right?
Yes, I interviewed Cuban Link a couple times actually. I did an interview with him probably in 2012 as well as more recently.
What are your thoughts on the whole Fat Joe versus Cuban Link situation?
Fat Joe and Cuban Link, man, it's a to be honest, the situation is a shame. You know what I mean? That we didn't get to see Big Pun blossom into the artist that he was supposed to be, where he had his own record label and he was putting out artists. Whether if that would have had a different impact for guys like Cuban Link, Prospect, you know what I mean, Remy and Tony, if it would have had a different impact, we don't know. You know what I mean? What would have been the position? You know, it's kind of like what happened with Diddy and Biggie. Would Biggie have taken on a label of his own as well? But it's very sad what happened to Cuban Link after working on his 24 Karat album for so long, getting so many different features, and then ultimately not getting to release the album because it really just seemed like they had taken so much time with that project. And the fact that they didn't really start to develop the other Terror Squad members, that's what ultimately hindered the Terror Squad group on the second album when they had Lean Back and the album only moved like 95,000 copies first week. The fact that nobody had really been properly introduced to the members of Terror Squad, you know what I mean? Like like 50 Cent spent years introducing us to Lloyd Banks and
Right.
then Young Buck and all, Tony Yayo, and then then putting out the Beg for Mercy album before releasing their solo albums. But yeah, that whole situation is tragic because then it got violent and it got taken to a place where it's almost like there's no returning from that. Even though it kind of seems like Cuban Link is a real official G to take getting sliced in the face like that and still even being open to have a conversation with Fat Joe. From my talks with him over the years, it kind of almost seemed like he would be willing to sit down with him and figure shit out. But like Fat Joe is saying, I'm not even going to do the Big Pun project until I get the official apology. And I would have to imagine that's where Fat Joe and Cuban Link come together again, because I think Cuban Link, being the best friend of Big Pun, would have to be like thoroughly involved in the project as well.
Most definitely, man. I mean, it is a sad situation because I feel like TS as a record label had so much potential, right? Imagine if Joe was able to put out all those individual projects and prove them to be successful. Imagine how many Latin artists would have came and signed with that label over the years. It would have became a powerhouse because of how much that group, those artists meant to that community, to the Latino community, as far as representation and everything. It would have did so much. And in the end, like, the fans are what really lose out on things, But I feel like through the conversations I've had with Cuban, he's been willing to admit certain things that he was at fault with. But I feel like publicly, at least, Joe has never vocalized any wrongdoing, anything, and in any situation, nobody is faultless. So whether you believe that, Joe is blackballing Cuban to the full extent, he was responsible for him to get his face cut or anything like that, everybody is responsible to some extent. But the fact that Joe has never humbly in any way admitted to any wrongdoing about anything, that's why I think there will never ever be peace between them. Because like you said, when you take things to the streets, it's damn near impossible for you to piece it up after that.
Yeah, this cycle, we've seen it repeated time and time again. You know what I mean? Like I was brought up Easy E a little bit earlier. Easy E had Dr. Dre and Ice Cube signed to his label, ultimately didn't really do anything with them, but he got a major deal for Ruthless Records. Gucci Man, you know what I mean? We've heard Free Frenchie. We've heard Frenchie talk about all types of shit about how Gucci got the major deal for Brick Squad, didn't really ultimately do anything for the Brick Squad members. Then you look at the situation with Fat Joe and Terror Squad, a label that really could have birthed so many different artists, from R&B singers to female rappers to other Latino rappers like Cuban Link coming up after Big Pun. You know what I mean? So we've seen this cycle really repeated multiple times throughout the industry, where the major artist just is not willing to take the gamble I think it's taking the gamble on the artist. Now, Fat Joe would probably disagree with that. He'd probably say, well, we spent X amount of dollars on the 24 Karat album. You know what I mean? But then they have records with Pink and they never released the album. I bet you if they would have put out a video with Pink and Cuban Link, the shit would have probably sold like 130,000 first week. But they just like to discredit sales like that, like it's nothing.
I think that's crazy because they said that the album didn't come out because it was projected to only sell 5,000 records. I mean, come on. During the 90s, early 2000s, that era, people weren't pirating music on the level, later on. So like it would have definitely still sold, especially because the amount of hype that was around that group at that time, especially people were looking at Cuban as being the next up artist, right? After Pun had passed. Like there was a lot of hype around him. And like you said, there was a lot of good features on that album. You could argue that they had put out the wrong singles, although I do think Flowers for the Dead was a appropriate single for that album because of the timing and the passing of Big Pun, But like you said, that Pink song would have definitely taken off.
Yeah, they kind of confused the buyers. They confused everybody with the history. If you remember back in the day when you would purchase an album, there would be like a flyer in it that would say, "This guy's album coming July, this album coming, this album coming," and they kind of confused all the fans that were purchasing the material. And then it's like, "Oh, another Fat Joe album? Oh, Get It Poppin', another Fat Joe album." Like, it's no doubt about it, Fat Joe sold some records, you know what I mean? But creating the legacy and actually creating the imprint, it would have just made everything so much bigger, and I've already named the 3 or 4 different artists that they could have had on their imprint.
Absolutely. I feel like Joe could have been viewed as a really big businessman, and it would have been amazing. Like it really is sad that it never came to fruition because I think that although Joe has experienced great fame and success since then, that particular era and what it could have been would have put him on a different trajectory entirely.
Yeah, he honestly could have been the president of Def Jam Records if he would have taken it a different way. Jay-Z became the president of Def Jam Records because he actually focused on putting out his artists like a real label would.
Mm-hmm. And I think that also that Cuban was ahead of his time with as far as thinking about the melodic kind of vocals, the melodic kind of songs, as well as incorporating some of that Latino kind of flavor to the music, because he said in the past that like Pun was very hesitant about that, and Joe definitely wasn't on board for that.
Well, if Fat Joe would have jumped on Flowers for the Dead, I bet they could have moved 30 or 40,000 units first week. And another thing I want to point out is I had done an interview with Young LA, T.I.'s artist. He had the song called Ain't I? If you remember, that song actually came out after Shoulder Lean. And his album they had 130,000 pre-sales for his album, and the label still would not release the album because they wanted to jack it up to at least $250,000 to $500,000 in pre-sales. So there's been many different, occurrences of rappers' albums being dropped. Like I remember hearing Cadillac Ta talking about taking a buyout on his album for $100,000. We'll put the album out, or we'll give you $100,000 to go back to the drawing board. You know what I mean? Sometimes you should take the album coming out, is all I want to say, so you can at least have the history.
Right, most definitely, man.